going home for the summer. I really do. I love going back to Alaska and seeing my family and all that. Even in the midst of a global pandemic, I love it. But I always dread coming home. And not just because, coming home means, work is starting up again, got to start getting up in the morning, got to start planning and all that. But because it seems like for the last couple years, every time I come home, everything in my apartment just decides it's done, and my apartment slowly begins to self-destruct. It has happened for years. It was my car. Every year it'd be come home and see what's the problem with the car. The battery's dead. The bumper fell off. I'm not making this up either. But lately it has been my apartment. For instance, this year I came home and found out that at some point while I was gone, my closet collapsed. So everything just, went down. In an attempt to put it back, I find that the battery to my drill gun is dead, and they don't seem to make that battery anymore. My washing machine has died, and they say they're going to get me a new one, but I haven't heard any movement on that. Tiles are peeling in my bathroom, and the other day, my cell phone finally crapped out, and I had to go buy a new cell phone. So if you're wondering why the framing and everything looks a little different in these videos, it's because I'm filming them on the new phone. So we're still trying to figure some stuff out. And it is just one thing after another, after another, after another. And I don't even own a home. I can only imagine how it feels for people who actually buy a home and have these things, things kind of domino on them. The closest I can get to imagining what that must feel like is 1986's The Money Pit. Oh, what a classic this is. Oh, Lord. So Tom Hanks and Shelley Long, as a young couple who are forced to vacate the apartment they were staying in and are tricked into buying a multi-million-dollar house for very little, and the reason why it's going for very, very little is because the place is a disaster, and shit just keeps getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. What I remember about this movie, one of the reasons I love this movie so much is because this is another one that I saw as a kid. I saw this movie so many times as a kid. Matter of fact, my mom and I saw this movie in the theater. And when we saw it, I believe we had just bought our house. And so we saw this, and we got home. My mom called my dad at the office and was like, "Are you sure the house is okay?" But this is one I remember seeing a lot as a kid, and it's one of those great 80s comedies that is adult and dealing with adult things, relationships, divorce, sex, real estate, buying a house. But the kid in you does not see any of that. You see the great slapstick. You see Tom Hanks yelling. He has one of the funniest yells in moviedom. And, see him, running upstairs as they're collapsing, or sees the bathtub falling through the floor or whatever. And you're laughing at that while your parents are getting kind of the connecting tissue. And then as you grow up and you are more familiar with life, the film takes on greater depth. I'm not saying it's a deep movie, but you understand the connecting tissue a little bit more. So I don't know really if this one qualifies as a forgotten gem. I think people still remember this one, but it's not one you see played a lot or referenced a lot. I know they referenced it on Family Guy once. I don't know, but they reference everything on Family Guy, so who knows if that's a sign of quality. But let's not BS this. Let's not beat around the bush. This is just a fucking funny movie. It is side-splitting. It is everything a big 80s comedy should be. And I think that comes down to your two leads. First and foremost, Tom Hanks. I've mentioned this before, and for those of you who have just known him as, Forrest Gump and onwards, you may not be aware of just how fucking funny this guy is. and how funny he was back in the day. He was a gifted comedian. So much, in fact, that most of the time, it wasn't until he did Philadelphia. Actually, it was the bridging between A League of Their Own and then into Philadelphia that people thought of him as a dramatic actor. Until then, he was that 80s comedian guy because he did it so well. And he did 80s comedy perfectly. 80s comedy is a very different animal from 90s, and not just in terms of the movies, but in the style, what we found funny. It's a very different thing, and he just embodied it. He is so funny here. He has the best reactions, everything from small reactions to huge over-the-top reactions. You know, like when they're filling water into the bathtub, and the bathtub just collapses and shatters. Actually, let's go back a second. So it's this whole sequence of events where he's going to get water in the kitchen. He flips on a light, and, you know, it starts this fire that kind of traces all over the wall. And he's just watching it. His eyes are big, and he goes back up to Shelley Long. He's like, the kitchen exploded. Just very deadpan, very straight. And then they pour the water in the bathtub. The bathtub falls through the floor and collapses, and he just lets out in this torrent of over-the-top, crazy donkey laughter. So in the span of about maybe 10 minutes, he has reacted to several things in several different ways, depending on the situation, and all of them hysterical. I think you also got to give a lot of credit to Shelley Long. Now, Shelley Long is one of those actors that I was never a big fan of. I find her more irritating than I find her funny. But at the same time, I can't deny she's really good in this. She plays off Tom Hanks very well. She's really good with zappy one-liners. Most of her comedy is verbal. She has a few physical bits, like when the raccoon jumps on her. But for the most part, it's her verbal sparring. And of course, she did that a lot on Cheers. And she and Hanks are bouncing them back and forth. When they have the obligatory breakup scene, because you have to have those in these movies, and she's insulting him, and he's insulting her right back, and it's just boom, 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 boom. It's really good timing. And I think good timing is the best way to describe everything that works so well in this film. To stage some of these bits, to stage the aforementioned, fuse fire in the kitchen that kind of goes around and goes here and hits this and hits it, you realize I can only believe they could only have shot that once, because resetting that would have taken for fucking ever. So it must have been a real, we need to know what we're doing and we need to have this down and go. And it fucking works. Later in the film, there's this like Rube Goldberg machine thing of Tom Hanks, bouncing all over the place, bouncing off the scaffolding, bouncing off this, bouncing off that, while the guys are working on the house. It's this very elaborate mousetrap kind of thing. And it's not only is it funny, but it's damn impressive to watch when you consider the directing and the planning that had to go into those shots to plan those out. It's really quite impressive. This film is also one of the only other films I can ever think of that has Alexander Gundadov, Carl from Die Hard. Like, I remember as a kid, those were the two movies I saw him in: Die Hard and this. And in Die Hard, he's a badass, henchman. He's like the odd job of the movie. And in this, he's supposed to be a comic character of an egotistical conductor. He plays it fairly well. Not great, but I realized watching this that I think that at a young age, you know, we always talk about how media influences children at a young age, and you don't really believe it. But I think my directing style may have been influenced by this guy, watching him as a young man. Because he's one of my favorite lines is he's directing, you know, the orchestra, and they get done. He's like, "The union demands that you be given lunch break. Those of you who can bring yourselves to eat, go stuff yourselves. I hope you choke." It's like, yeah, that sounds like one of my note sessions, actually. He's okay. He's not fantastic, but he's good enough and gets it done. Another thing kind of in the pacing of this movie, this film has the same a pacing thing. It's not a problem. It's just a thing that they do. Very similar to what they did in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. If you remember Trains, Planes, and Automobiles, like Steve Martin and John Candy have the big blow up, the big fight, the thing that you would normally save for the end of the movie, right at the beginning. So you get that out of the way because you think, well, that's the audience is conditioned to think something like that is the climax. That's where everything, you know, that's what you're aiming towards. You get there, and then you're in the downhill. So now you realize that everything's going to happen after that moment can only get worse. And this film does the same thing with one of the first things that goes wrong. It's this little sequence, and it starts out with just, you know, the doorbell not working, the door falling off, the disgusting water, little things, and it builds to the fucking stairs collapsing under Tom Hanks and him running up them. You know, the fucking stairs collapsing. You know, that is a huge, in any other movie, that would be the climax. That would be the worst thing that could happen. But here, it says, no, this is like one of the first things that happens. So everything else that happens after this, it can only get worse. And it does. And that's just smart in terms of story structure, especially when you're trying to keep an audience off balance of, oh no, what's going to happen to this poor guy next? Is this movie perfect? No movie is perfect, but I'll be honest, I'm having a hard time thinking of anything that's really wrong with it. I think the worst thing is that while Shelley Long and Tom Hanks do have good chemistry, it's always clear when one actor is better than the other. They're not an even match. They're good, but Tom Hanks, even at this young age, is clearly the better actor. Clearly. And as such, there are times where their chemistry is a little off, or the scene feels a little unbalanced. He has a much more natural delivery, and everything feels fluid and spontaneous, whereas there feels like there's a lot of, everything's a little pre-planned and prepared. It's a minor thing. It doesn't ruin the film. It's just if I had to think of something wrong with it, or a thing that kind of throws it off balance, it's that. I gotta say one last thing about this movie before I wrap up. One of the things I love about movies from this time is it feels like every movie from this period had its own, like a Bond movie, they all had their own theme songs. Very catchy, very memorable songs that were written just for them. The 80s, I've mentioned this before, is the epicenter for classic soundtracks. You know, even if it's not the whole soundtrack, it's at least one song, the title song. You know, you think of the Rodney Dangerfield film Back to School, and that theme, which is awesome. And you've got this, how do you build a house, how do the roses grow? It's just catchy, and it sings in there. And I was thinking about, you know, why do I obsess about this? And I think it's because, even if it's not true, having these really catchy, really, I don't want to say inspirational, but unique themes for movies made them feel like their own unique animal. It doesn't make them feel like a cookie cutter process. You know, here's the latest comedy from whoever. Here's you know, here's so-and-so, and guess what? He's playing the same character he played in every movie. You know, here's a unique film, so unique, we had a song written specifically for it. So I feel like that's one of the reasons I love the music from some of these movies so much, is because it feels like it gave them their own personality. And I don't know why, but it really feels like in the 80s, filmmakers had a talent for matching music to their film. Opening and closing credit music kind of thing. They really had a talent for finding the song, or creating the song, or hiring the people to create the song that just encapsulates the movie, fixes it in your mind, and makes it so you can't think of one without the other. So yeah. Not much more to say on this one, but I find with the comedies there isn't a whole lot to go into aside from some of the basic beats. But I still laugh my ass off at this movie every time. It is a comedy classic, and if you have never seen it before, even if you have never had house problems to this extent, I think at this point in history we can all relate to the feeling of the world continuously collapsing right under us, and just when we think shit can't get any worse, it does. Well, maybe if you can see Tom Hanks get through it, maybe we can too. So if you haven't seen this one, or you haven't seen it in a while, go check it out. I think we could all use a good Tom Hanks donkey laugh. So thanks for joining me, and as always, drive safe, and I will see you at the movies.